Okay. Good morning, everybody. Very welcome. My name is Cormac Hogan, and I'm going to talk to you today about Data Services Manager. Now, show of hands, how many of you have heard of Data Services Manager? Okay, quite a few of you. How many of you run databases on-prem on your vSphere or VCF environments today? Okay, so this should be of interest to you. Essentially, what we're going to be talking about is how you can use Data Services Manager to offer database as a service on-prem to your users. So without further ado, this is just for myself, in case I say something I'm not supposed to say, which is a distinct possibility. But what we're going to talk about is realistically the next release of Data Services Manager, which should be out imminently, along with the 9.0.1 release of VCF. Okay, so let's introduce it. Now, the first thing I want to highlight is that you don't need VCF 9 to get started with this. In fact, you don't even need VCF. Data Services Manager will just work on vSphere standalone as well. So if you're looking to do just a POC of this Data Services Manager product, you just need vSphere to get started. However, one thing I will call out, and one thing that we are working very diligently on at the moment, is to introduce Microsoft SQL Server to Data Services Manager. So basically, to be able to roll out Microsoft SQL Server instances and databases through this product. Again, by show of hands, how many of you still run Microsoft SQL Server today? Quite a lot of you. Okay, so this could be very interesting. The second thing I do want to call out to you as well is to do with VCF automation and VCF 9. Now, if you did want to integrate Data Services Manager with VCF 9 and VCF automation, you will actually need to use DSM version 9 to do that. And so I have a demo of two of these things to show you. I'm going to show you how far we've got with our Microsoft SQL Server integration, and I'm also going to show you the VCF automation integration that we have done as well. But before we get into that, let's do a little bit of groundwork. Let's show you all about how this works. So you should be familiar with this. This is just vSphere, VCF. You have your storage, your hypervisors. Built on top of that, you would have vSphere clusters and resources, and then you would have your vCenter server. So how do I get started with Data Services Manager? What we do is we provide you with a plugin. So the VI admin will come along, install the plugin into the vCenter server. That will expand your vSphere client and give you Data Service Manager offerings to be able to do things. The main goal for the VI admin with Data Service Manager is to put a guardrail around resources and prevent what we call data sprawl. You don't want databases just popping up all over your infrastructure. The infrastructure policy, which the VI admin creates, is like a guardrail around a set of resources: compute, storage, networking, and so on. And so once you have that infrastructure policy in place, that is the only set of resources that will be consumed by the databases that you provision through Data Service Manager. Okay? So once we have that built, then we can hand it off to whoever the data admin is. It may still be the VI admin, but typically in a lot of organizations, there is somebody responsible for the provisioning out of the databases. So we're going to talk about that persona as a data admin. They will come to the plugin, which has its own portal now. So we roll out an appliance. It has its own portal. It has its own UI. And from there, you can start provisioning databases. So what's just happened here is that there has been a request for a clustered database, a highly available database running Postgres. We will put that onto 3 separate virtual machines. Those virtual machines run a Kubernetes cluster, and then the database is instantiated on top of that Kubernetes cluster. Now, there's nothing for the data admin to worry about here, because Data Services Manager is taking care of the provisioning of the VMs, it's taking care of the provisioning of Kubernetes cluster, it's taking care of instantiating the database on top of all of that. The only thing that they have to hand off then to an end user is a connection string to the database, and the end users can now go and consume that database. Now, this is a traditional ticket-based approach. So you can imagine that the end user has filed a ticket through ServiceNow or whatever the case may be. That comes to the data admin, and then that triggers the data admin to roll out the database on behalf of the end user, give them the connection string, they can consume the database. But in a lot of organizations, there is a demand for self-service from these end users, especially if they're developers or so on. So we can also offer that as well. So the end users could connect to Data Services Manager, either through the UI or through the API, which is a full-blown Kubernetes API, describe their database that they want, send it off to the API server that's running on DSM, and provision their own databases. In this case, it was a request for a highly available MySQL. And we roll it out in exactly the same way. Now, I have put it on a different infrastructure policy here, just to highlight the fact that you can have multiple infrastructure policies representing different parts of your infrastructure. So different resources in each infrastructure policy. But, of course, you could have just a single infrastructure policy for provisioning all of the databases that we talk about as well. So there's a lot of, granularity on the controls that you can have. So the last database to talk about, the one we support, but it is a tech preview, is Microsoft SQL Server. So I haven't drawn this as 3 nodes. I've just drawn this as a single standalone node. The Postgres and MySQL could also be just single node as well. But one of the things we aim to get to before we officially launch Microsoft SQL Server is to be able to cluster it as well with Always On. So when we get to being able to cluster SQL Server, we will launch it possibly around, well, I guess it'll be sometime next year that we're hoping to get that. So just on that, we could do the ticket-based approach. We could do self-service. We support the 3 databases we highlight there. So just a little bit more about those databases: Postgres, MySQL, SQL Server. Various versions of each. As I said, we can roll them out standalone, but for Postgres and MySQL, we spent a lot of time making them enterprise-ready. We can do cluster deployments of those databases as well. We can replicate them for DR-type scenarios, all of that stuff. And if you're familiar with Private AI Foundation, PAIF, that also uses DSM to provision the Postgres databases that then have the PG vector extension to provide a vector database. So, okay, good so far? So let's talk about one new feature. Now, what I've shown you there is a bunch of different infrastructure policies. And what we've had up until now is that anyone who logged into the DSM portal could see all of the infrastructure policies, which wasn't really ideal. You were kind of trusting your users or your end users to use the correct policy. So we had that feedback, and so what we've done is we've introduced a new RBAC, or role-based authentication control, where we're able to set different users, associate them with different infrastructure policies. So they only see the policies that they're entitled to and consume the resources that they're entitled to. So 2 different things. One is called a namespace. Think of that as nothing more than a grouping of users. And then we have a thing called a data service policy, where we add the users and we add the infrastructure policies and the databases that they're allowed access. And we put all that into a data service policy. What that essentially means is when a user logs in, they only get access to what we've put into their data service policy. So maybe we say they can only provision Postgres, they will only be able to see Postgres. Maybe we say they can provision all of the databases, but they must provision it onto this vSphere cluster. That's another way we can use the data service policy. So far, so good? Okay. So let's kind of put it together in a kind of diagrammatic form. Let's say I have a bunch of devs or end users who are responsible for standing up databases for the sales, another bunch for finance, another for marketing, whatever the case may be. So I'm going to set up 2 data service policies, one for Postgres, one for MySQL. And what I want to make sure is that the sales guys are only provisioning Postgres, but the finance and marketing are only provisioning databases on SQL Server. And so this is what we would do, is create a namespace, associate the namespace with the policy, associate an infrastructure policy with that data service policy. So now only those sales guys can provision Postgres databases, but they can only provision it onto the vSphere infrastructure defined in that yellow infrastructure policy. Conversely, if we look at the Microsoft SQL Server, I can have two different namespaces, one with a group of finance users, one with a group of marketing users, and they provision onto a completely different set of vSphere infrastructure as well. So that's a very simple diagrammatic representation of that. What I want to show you now is our first demo. And I'll introduce you to some of the things, because we've had this in tech preview since 9.0. We're introducing some new features in 9.01. I'll introduce those to you, and then we'll get into the demonstration. So we're dealing with both SQL Server instances, and then once you have that instance set up, you can build databases there as well. So what we want is a DBaaS, a database as a service, where individual users can connect to an instance, but provision their own databases on that instance. So we have a whole bunch of things, and this is true for all of the different databases. We just don't have time to get into all of the things, but we have custom certificate controls, we have automated backup, we have automated lifecycle management as well. So you just stage a patch that we provide to you, and we can roll that patch out during a maintenance window, and all of the usual stuff as well, like cloning, restore from backup. And last but not least, that full API experience, it is running Kubernetes. So if your devs are familiar with Kubernetes, with YAML manifests, yet another markup language, they can actually describe the database they want, and they can provision it fully through API. They don't have to touch the UI at all. One thing we did have is support for Active Directory in the initial 9.0 release, but it was a very manual process. So essentially what we have done in the 9.01, when it becomes available, is that we're going to have an automated Windows authentication mechanism included. So what you will do is you'll create a privileged user. That privileged user will be able to set, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but there's a thing called SPNs, service principal names. So once a user has that capability, they can give users Windows authentication to the database. We can update DNS records automatically if you give that privileged user the ability to do that. And then feedback from customers who are design partners with us, going through what they wanted to set up on SQL Server. We can do lots of things like collation, which I'm not a database guy, but I think it's got to do with pattern matching and all that stuff in the database, setting advanced settings in the configuration file, trace flags, and then auditing as well, auditing users who are logging into the database, failed logins, all of that good stuff. So that's what we've introduced in the 9.0.1 release. And as I said, we're doing updates with each release, and so eventually we will have this early next year sometime, hopefully generally available. All right, that's enough of me kind of talking through slides. Let's go and see this thing in action. So what I want to do is I want to have a bunch of finance users automatically provision databases on SQL Server. So I have created, I hope you can see that, it's big enough, but I have an Active Directory group with a couple of users in here, Paudie and Junchi. Those two users, I want to give them the capability to provision databases. This is my DSM UI. This is the DSM portal, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this namespace construct that I was talking about, and I want to associate that namespace construct with those finance users, the Junchi and the Paudie. So I'll create this namespace called finance namespace. Now I go to my permissions section. We can fully integrate with LDAP, Active Directory, so I can pull in an Active Directory group. It's exactly what I'm doing here, and I'm going to map anyone from that group, the DSM users finance, as a user and put them into that namespace. So now I have built my namespace. My namespace is nothing more than having a few users inside it. I'm just checking to make sure those users from Active Directory work by just logging in. Great, they seem to be working. So now I'm going to go back in as an administrator. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a SQL Server instance. Firstly, I want to have it automatically integrated with Active Directory. So I have a special user here, a privileged user called Cormac, funnily enough. And that's the guy who's going to be able to build these additional users and grant them SPNs, these service principal names for doing Windows authentication. So there you go, it's the CU there. This is SQL Server 2022, by the way. It's just got some funky Microsoft naming convention associated with it. But what I'm doing now is I'm going to build a SQL Server instance. I'm going to build it with a user, an Active Directory user, SQL01 user. This SQL01 user is going to be able to do the Windows authentication on the database. I'm going to select an infrastructure policy. I'm going to be able to do lots of cool things like select the storage policy, set the size of the virtual machine, how big the data disks are going to be, and this is some of the advanced options I talked to you about as well, things that I can do with that SQL Server instance that your Microsoft DBAs will be very happy about. Correlation settings, advanced settings, auditing settings, all available at provisioning time of the database. Now again, we're looking at Microsoft SQL Server, but we have the same level of detail that we can get into with the Postgres databases and the MySQL databases as well. So this is just checking the auditing. We can do vSphere tagging, so we can bubble up these virtual machines with vSphere tags. A lot of our customers use vSphere tags for all sorts of things, whether it's billing or whether it's even associating virtual machines with certain entities. We can use those vSphere tags when we provision the database as well. So speeding things along, my SQL Server instance is now up and running. And what we're going to do next is I'm just going to copy the connection string. I'm going to RDP as that SQL01 user onto his own desktop, or her own desktop. I'm going to launch Microsoft SQL Server Studio, which is a very common tool for managing Microsoft SQL Server, SQL Server Studio. So the first thing I have to do is I'm going to log in as an SA user, the system administrator user, because I have to create a login. These logins don't get created automatically on the instance, so it's just a very simple SQL Server command for my user, my Active Directory user. Disconnect as SA, try and connect now with Windows authentication. Will it work? I'm in. So there we go, we provisioned this database, or this instance I should say, from DSM. I can see all of the system databases, the master, the model, all of that good stuff. So my instance is up and running, it's working, that user is able to set SPNs. So now the next step, in order to be able to do DBaaS for these finance users, is I'm going to create a data service policy and say, I want to give these users who are in this finance namespace access to this SQL Server instance so that they can build their own databases. And that's what I'm running through here. I'm selecting that SQL Server instance. You can imagine I could have lots of them, but this is just selecting one for this policy. You do things like backup locations. We didn't really get into that, but don't worry about it too much. There's a bunch of things you can do in this setup. But now once the data service policy is created, you can see it here, these Active Directory users now can access the instance and build their own databases. So let's try it out. So I'm going to log in here now as, I think it was Junchi who came in here. I'm going to give it a name. I'm calling it Junchi DB01. It's automatically selected the instance. There's my username that I want to put on the database. Looks good. Speeded it up. It only takes a couple of seconds anyway. But there we go. The database has now been built on the SQL Server instance. User Junchi has access. He's basically built his own database through the UI. Let's check if Junchi can get on. He can't, because by default, SQL Server Studio is trying to go onto the master and the system databases. So I just got to make sure he selects his own database. Hey presto. And guess what? He can only see his own database. He doesn't see the system databases. He's only seeing the database that he built himself. Any questions about that? It looks kind of straightforward, I think. There's a few things in there all right. I mean, there's definitely some SQL Server specific stuff like this SPN feature, the service principal name, but that's nothing more than giving somebody the ability to create Windows authentication on the database rather than just using SQL Server authentication. And that's feedback we got from a lot of our customers as a security precaution. They don't allow SQL Server authentication, they only allow Windows authentication. But in this version, even though it's still tech preview, we've automated that whole process. Okay. So just reiterating, it is a tech preview. We're working towards making it generally available. But what we've achieved, I think, between the 9.0 release and the 9.01 release of making this fully automated end-to-end with this privileged user. And again, if you're not comfortable with putting a privileged user into DSM, you can still use a manual approach by setting these SPNs on the user. But I think using this automated approach definitely speeds things up a lot. Okay, I'm going to switch tack. How many of you are on your, well, I'm going to make an assumption that everyone is on a VCF journey at this point, right? Would that be true? Okay, I'll assume yes. So this now is VCF automation. So it's an integral part of how you do consumption, how you do multi-tenancy in VCF. And what I'm going to show you is how DSM is already integrated with VCF automation, so much so that your different tenants in your different organizations of VCF have the ability to provision their own databases. So what they will do is they will make a request through the VCF automation portal. It's going to be a service like any other service. So if you're familiar with the Kubernetes Service, VKS, if you're familiar with the VM service, we will now have DSM integrated to provide you databases as a service within VCF automation. And again, for tenants can just provision their own databases. So how do I get started? Well, first off, you have to enable data services and essentially connect your VCF automation to DSM. So when you come to this landing page, this is the provider administrator within VCF automation that we're looking at. When you come to their landing page, drill down along the left-hand side, there's VCF services, one of which is VCF data services. Select that, and what you'll have is a configure service where you're just going to connect VCF automation to your DSM, your data services manager. So all you're going to fill in username, password, a CA certificate, IP address, or FQDN, and that's it. Connect the two of them together. And once they're connected, you can then move on to provisioning your databases. Now, one thing that I suppose I should highlight before we get into it in too much detail here, when we provisioned the databases in the DSM UI previously for Postgres, MySQL, SQL Server, what we were doing is we were provisioning virtual machines. Those virtual machines had Kubernetes installed, and they would build their own vanilla Kubernetes cluster to host the database. One of the options we have with VCF and VCF automation integration and the Supervisor is that we can actually use a vSphere namespace or a Supervisor namespace as our infrastructure policy. If you take that approach, we won't stand up the vanilla Kubernetes. What we'll do is we'll use the VKS, the vSphere Kubernetes Service, to stand up the Kubernetes that will host the database for us. So it's a subtle distinction. You can still do it the traditional approach. You can still just stand up on vSphere infrastructure using VCF automation, but you have an additional option of using a vSphere namespace as your infrastructure policy, and then rolling out the database into a vSphere namespace. But the difference is that we will use VKS in the case of the vSphere namespace, just a subtle difference. Now, if we're going with namespaces, and that's the demo I want to show you, and we're going to use VKS, there's a very interesting approach we can take. You could, of course, let the tenants provision their own databases within their own tenant namespace. And so you could, again, end up with the databases popping up all over the place again. But another approach you could take is you could create a dedicated namespace, project namespace within VCF automation, and we could stand up all the databases in that particular namespace. Now, for those of you not familiar with VCF automation, there's a lot of terminology like regions, and namespaces, and projects, and organizations. I'm going to try and keep it simple, but it can be a bit daunting to kind of digest all of these different new concepts that are in VCFA. But the whole idea of what we're trying to do here is simply stand up all the databases in one place, because you as a provider administrator can then manage that more easily. So you could set your own SLAs on the backing infrastructure that's standing up all of these databases, much easier to manage, much easier to forecast usage, all of those kind of things. It's just one optional approach, but we think it makes a lot of sense to take this approach. So I'm going to show you this again diagrammatically. I'm a sucker for a diagram. Here we have a region which is nothing more than, I usually think of it as your NSX landscape, everything that's connected to the same NSX. But within here, we can create organizations, we can create quotas of resources for organizations, we can create namespaces. And once you have a namespace, once as a tenant you have a namespace, you can start to consume the different services that I was talking about. VKS service, VM service, and of course, DSM database as a service. So you do need that namespace construct before you can start consuming. So let's say I've built up a bunch of these. I mean, I'm just showing you one here, but let's say we have lots of tenants. There's lots of users in each tenant, in each org. And now they want to start consuming databases. So what we could do is we could set aside a completely separate namespace just for DSM. And what will happen then is as these users request a database, we instantiate it over on the DSM namespace, not in their own namespace, in our dedicated one, and we just give them the connection string back. Actually, they can retrieve it themselves. So again, it's just one approach that we could take with VCF automation in that we set aside dedicated namespace and all of our databases get stood up there. It becomes a lot easier for you as the provider administrator to manage all of that. Is that making sense? Okay, great. Okay. As I said, it's optional, but we think it makes a lot of sense. This is just what a namespace looks like. It's essentially a grouping of resources, the things you can do. If you've seen the Supervisor before, if you've seen vSphere namespaces before, all of this becomes very familiar. But essentially what we're doing is we're saying consumers of this namespace, they're able to set up virtual machines of this size, they're able to consume this amount of storage. You get the idea. It's nothing more than a grouping of resources. So I'm going to set aside a whole bunch of resources so that databases that get provisioned, they consume the resources defined in this namespace only. Now we have to do the data service policy again. The only difference now, rather than users logging directly into DSM, we have all of these organizations, we have all of these projects within VCFA. The projects have lots of different users. We don't want maybe every user to be able to access every database. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a data service policy, and we're going to say this group of users can consume these databases, this group of users can consume these databases, they can only consume these versions because my line of business tells me I can only use these versions because they're the ones we validated. You get the idea. So data service policy, very similar to what we saw previously, but in VCFA, it's dealing with a different set of users, which are the organization users. So this is one part of it, just defining, is it Postgres, is it MySQL? Eventually we will have SQL Server plumbed up in here as well. But for the purposes of this demo, we're going to focus on Postgres. Keep going. Now I'm clicking an infrastructure policy. The infrastructure policy now is that namespace that I just built. So rather than just traditional vSphere resources, I'm going to say use a namespace to build the databases. And there we go. Let's go and look at the provisioning. Provisioning is very straightforward. This is now me logged in as a tenant. I'm in my tenant organization. You can see down on the left-hand side the different services. So I can do virtual machine service, I can do Kubernetes service, but down at the bottom, I have a database service that I can provision as well. So I click that. It's what I can do with it is what I mean by that is the database that I'm allowed to provision is defined by the data service policy that has been associated with the organization that I'm a member of. Just roll that out. And then you can do things like pick up the connection string, look at the YAML manifest. If you're interested in doing GitOpsy type of stuff, it's all in there. But essentially what we've achieved is we're saying different users from different organizations can provision their own databases through VCF automation. That's the kind of takeaway. Alrighty. So another demo. This time, we're going to switch tack, as I said. We're going to go to VCF automation, and we're going to see how we can do all of what I just described. So if you haven't seen it before, this is the landing page for the provider administrator within VCF automation. You can define lots of different organizations. I just have two. One is my provider organization, and in this provider organization, I have set aside a namespace, and this is the namespace where I'm going to provision my databases. So we can go under Manage and Govern. There's a lot of clicking around. I do apologize. It's quite a beast, VCF automation. But the takeaway is there's a project called DBaaS. There's a namespace called DBaaS DSM. So when I go and build my data service policy shortly, I'm going to be landing all of my databases into this namespace that belongs to the provider. So let's go ahead. You can see some of the services that are in here. Data services, I've already set it up. If we look at the settings, it's nothing more than connecting back to my data service manager. So now I can go ahead and build my new data service policy. So it's going to be on Postgres. This time it's going to be Postgres, and I'm building this data service policy to give certain users and certain organizations the ability to provision Postgres databases. So you can assign these to all your organizations, or you can select individual organizations as well. I'm just going to use this CJH Orgo 1. Postgres, we support lots of different versions, 16, 15, 14, so a whole bunch of them. So I'm selecting which versions of Postgres, and now I'm going to select the infrastructure policy, which is pointing to that namespace in the provider organization. So it's going to be in a completely different organization to where I am. And there we go. Data services policy is created. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch personas. I'm going to log in as a tenant, an end user, if you will. So this looks slightly different now, but there's a default project created. Doesn't have any namespaces, but I do have to create a namespace in order to be able to leverage the different services that are available. So I'm just going to build a tenant namespace. Pick a class for the namespace, the region, VPCs. As I said, there's a lot of new building blocks now with VCF automation, but don't sweat it too much. The idea here is that we're building a namespace for the tenant so that they can actually consume services. And when that's done, go ahead and create that. I can then go over to the build and deploy view. If I remember my demo, let's just let that create first. Yeah. So over in build and deploy, can you see down here now that I might be a user with lots of namespaces, but actually I only have one namespace, which has been automatically selected. There's all my services, and what I want to do is I want to create a database. So again, this might look very familiar to what we were doing previously with SQL Server, where we were selecting versions and editions. We were selecting maybe the, well, in SQL Server, we wouldn't have been able to do the clustering, but you could select standalone or clustered here as well, selecting the infrastructure policy, storage policy, size of the virtual machines that are going to back this database, disk size, all of this information looks, what we're going through here, this wizard is exactly what's on the DSM UI. So you can do other stuff as well, such as host-based access controls, all of that good stuff. Let's not worry about it. We just want to get this database up and running. Let's have a look. I think I speed things along here as well. These things usually take a couple of minutes. But we can look at what's going on in the Data Service Manager UI. So this is where we were previously for SQL Server. You can see it's in progress. It's starting to roll out. It's a single node. And indeed, you can tell it's coming from a tenant namespace. So that's who requested this database. So all of that is captured in the metadata. And even in our vSphere client, we can see all of this going on. Again, if you're familiar with the Supervisor, if you've used vSphere with Tanzu, what it used to be called before, some of this will look familiar to you. You can go into your Supervisor. You can actually see the namespaces that we've been building. You can actually see the clusters. Remember I said now, because it's in a namespace, we're building a VKS cluster. All of that is visible through the vSphere client. There it is there. So again, we'll speed things along. There's nothing in the tenant, as you can see, but the actual database has been instantiated in that provider namespace. Okay, so speed it along. The database becomes ready. We can have a look at it. As I said, you can view the YAML of this as well if you so wished. Okay, I think I'm just reiterating the fact that we did successfully create the database. Okay, yes. Yeah. There's our Kubernetes cluster, our VKS cluster, and single virtual machine backing that VKS cluster. Okay, let's go back and look at some interesting stuff. So here we are back in VCFA. As I said, if you're into GitOpsy type of operations, you could completely do this through the API as well, describe the database in YAML, or we can just get the connection string. So what I want to do now is just connect to this database as an end user. I've requested it to be provisioned. I'm just going to use something like pgadmin to connect to it. There we go. Use that connection string that I just copied out of VCFA. Database looks good. And we can just run some queries just to prove to you it's working. Okay. So what we've just achieved is we've made database as a service available to our tenants within VCF automation. And we've done that by simply integrating our VCF automation with Data Services Manager. But the point is you can control what your tenants can do. Your tenants, you can, through the data service policies, you can give your tenants access to Postgres and say you can only provision this version of Postgres and you can only provision it to this particular vSphere location or namespace. Or similarly with MySQL. You can, again, have controls over where do they provision it, what they're allowed to provision. And coming back to this concept of having the dedicated namespace, we just think that if all of the databases for your database as a service were landing in the same place, it becomes easier for you to manage. But having said that, you may feel like you want to give your tenants the ability to provision in their own namespace. That is achievable as well. So I pause there. Any questions about what I've shown you in that particular demo? No? Okay. I'm sure you can. Well, I'll be milling around for a bit afterwards anyway, so if there are some questions, please come and find me. More than happy to talk to you about this. Okay, so we're nearly there. Just to highlight some of the differences with the provisioning approach, we looked at namespaces versus the traditional DSM approach. If you remember when we did the SQL Server, I was saying I'm selecting vSphere resources. It could be a vSphere cluster, it could be a resource pool. I had these VM classes, I had these storage policies. They were all part of vSphere. The difference with taking the namespace approach is, as I said here, we're not standing up a vanilla Kubernetes cluster. We're actually using the VKS service to back the database, and because it's a supervisor namespace, all of the things that are associated with a supervisor namespace, from VM classes, storage classes, all of that stuff comes from the namespace. So it's just a different way of thinking of things, but if you're going all in VCFA, all in supervisor, this might be an interesting approach to take to offer a database as a service. So calling out just a few things that we're doing in 9.01, maybe for those of you who looked at 9.0 before, or even the 2.x version, it's just some of the things that we are doing with the Postgres, the MySQL, and the SQL Server. I've probably already talked about these in some detail, but for Postgres, there was definitely interest in DR type scenarios. So this is where you might have one vSphere infrastructure with one DSM running all your databases. If that goes down, what happens to these databases? Well, what we can do is we can replicate them to a completely different vSphere infrastructure running a completely different DSM, and we have all the bells and whistles to do failover, failback, that kind of thing between your two sites. We're doing MySQL kind of lags Postgres. Postgres, for some reason, especially in EMEA, is the most popular of the open source databases that we see. MySQL tends to be a lagger then behind the Postgres, but we usually catch up just a release or so afterwards. So we tend to put the new stuff into Postgres, and then we follow that up with MySQL. And all of the stuff we're doing with Microsoft SQL Server, I think I've shown you the Active Directory integration was our main aim. The automation of all of that was our main aim for the 9.01 release. But as I said, we won't be releasing this until we have a clustered solution available for our customers, because we want to do enterprise-ready databases on top of VCF. Okay. And where can you go to learn more? I blog a little bit, so I talk an awful lot about Data Services Manager. If you're interested in learning more, just pop on there. We have a hands-on lab. It was upgraded for Vegas, so it might even be available to take here. And if you are interested in Data Services Manager, there is a free evaluation that you can fill out. It's the third slide there. I'll leave it up there. It means we'll reach out to you, we'll get you started, we'll tell you what you need for a POC, we'll do some white glove, hands-on enablement for you, all of that good stuff, just to get you started and just to get you kicking the tires and see what you think and whether it meets your needs. So I'm going to give you a few minutes back. As I said, I will be milling around, but I want to thank you for coming to my session. Thank you.